On this episode of Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts, target date funds, the good, the bad, the ugly. Let's talk about them a little bit with Phil this week here on the show. Let's get into it. Welcome into Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts with CPA and personal financial specialist Phil Putney. Now let's get rolling with today's show. Hey gang, thanks for hanging out with Phil and I as we talk investing, finance, and retirement. And Phil, we're going to dive into target date funds for a few minutes this week here on the show. You just kind of really wanted to talk on a few main points of this. I think it's one of those things where it's easy to use. We all grab them, especially if you don't really have much, knowledge about what you want to do when it comes to your finance. That's why it was created, and it works. Right. Sort of well. I mean, it does its job, I guess, but there's a lot of better options out there. And so we want to kind of highlight a few, I guess, pros and cons, if you will. So let's get into it this week. First of all, I hope you're doing well. But, what is a target date fund? That's good. Well, what is a target date fund and what's its purpose?
So, a target date fund is basically a fund that's on a glide path that, depending on the target date, as it approaches that date, becomes more quote unquote conservative, right? So high level, two components, bonds and in stock, or stock and bond, if you want to think of it that way, from a relationship, equity versus the bond side of it. So they've been around 30 years, really gained popularity probably in the last 20 or so, especially maybe the last to 15 in 401k plans, So, it's now in most 401k plans, their default set of investment options is going to be a series of target date funds that if you look at your plan documents, if you don't pick, they're going to plug you into certain target dates based on your age. And the 401k plan will tell you, okay, hey, if you're age 40, then you're going to be in this target date fund if you don't tell them otherwise. So,
yeah.
So, yeah, that's what they are.
And that's the thing, right?
Kind of a set it and forget it, right? You pick a target date and it'll automatically do the work for you to quote unquote become more conservative. But that is where some of the problems lie. Right.
So let's talk about a few pieces of that. So, if you're not sure what you want to do and you think, okay, hey, 2040 is when I'm going to be of age, we'll just throw a random one out there. I'll just pick a 2040 fund. Now, when these things first started a number of years ago, again, this was the point to make it easy for folks who aren't really sure what to do and they need to be saving for retirement. That's great. But it's evolved so much in 30 years. Phil, if you go looking right now and you pick a 2040 fund, there's a whole lot of those. It's not like there's just one or two.
Correct.
There's now like thousands of different kind of brackets. There's thousands of 2025, 2030s, 35, 40, so on and so forth. So now that simple thing gets even more daunting because then you think, well, which target date fund for my year should I pick? So that's the first piece that's confusing.
Right. Yeah. Every fund family out there now has their own series and maybe 2 or 3 different series of target date funds that may be structured a little bit differently. Again, at a high level, they're all designed to do something similar, and that is moving down that glide path of, earlier. Think of it this way, the later the target date fund, the higher the equity exposure. So a 2050 fund is going to have a lot more equity exposure than a 2030 fund or a 2025 fund. Because as that date approaches, it starts to move more into the bond side of the equation. And this is where I think a lot of people don't understand the risk involved. Again, it's a set it and forget it. It's this glide path. You don't get to pick other than the date. But most target date funds are designed such that when it hits that year, so let's say you pick the 2025 fund, well, in 2025, it's targeted to be around a 60-40, 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio. Maybe, not quite that, maybe 55-45, but in that range. Yeah. So again, just getting that, some people thinking, oh, that's okay. That's within my comfort level. Others are thinking, wait a minute, I'm retired. That's way too much risk. I didn't want 50, 60% of my portfolio in stocks at that point.
Right. Well, that's a good point because, sometimes when you're thinking about these or you're hearing about them or you think, okay, even if you don't, have any knowledge whatsoever, you think, okay, well, this is a 2040 fund. That's when I'm going to retire. So therefore, by the time I get to the year 2040, it's going to not be having a risk in there, right? And so some people do think, I think, or are misled to think that it comes maybe even all the way down to zero risk. And they absolutely do not do that. So you've got to make sure that you understand what they do.
I was going to say, even beyond that target date, they do continue to shift more to the bond side of the equation. So I mean, they will eventually get to a much higher level of bond exposure. I don't think it ever gets to 100% bonds. From what I've seen in any of them.
So that's one of those things where when you're thinking about it, it's easy to set it and forget it, but there's so many better options out there for folks, but they don't have the financial education to really understand. Because again, it's scary when you see multiple of different kinds of things. You think, I don't know what the best one's going to be for me. I just want to save money for retirement.
Right. Yeah. Not to say the target date fund is the wrong thing, but you just have to know what you're getting into. And it's, to your point, it's really meant to help make it a little bit easier for that individual, especially like in a 401k plan, know which investment option to pick rather than, go through the 15, 20 options you might have to put together a portfolio. Well, if you set it at a target date, it'll automatically shift a little bit less risky over time. Because I mean, that's a lot of times I'll see, a client come in that set their 401k plan investment options 20 years ago when they first entered into that job, never changed it since, and they might all be in small cap and international and, some large cap. I mean, it's all stock. And now they're 65 coming to me looking at retirement, and they've got all this equity exposure, which they've never changed, which might have been really appropriate when they first started. For somebody right now, it probably has played out okay, but depending on time frames, it might not have played out okay. So this is somewhat of a hedge against that. But again, it's being active in picking and designing specifically the investments you want, or the easy set it and forget it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's very, I guess when it comes down to it, because it is so easy, Phil, and it's easy for us to get into it, if you don't really know where to turn, you're just going to roll with it. And that's better than nothing. But often I think we don't understand the pricing behind these either, because they're not the cheapest options out there.
No, because it's a fund of funds, right? So these target funds are buying either equity mutual funds and bond mutual funds in the portfolio. So you have two layers of fund fees. You've got the underlying equity and bond funds, and you have the target date fund fees. Now, the target date fund fees are probably a lot less because they're not actively managed. It's, it's set in this glide scale to get more conservative, but it's still just another layer of fees that are added on top. So understanding truly what all the costs are involved in that, and really what it's doing, and the other side of it is risk. I mean, I think a lot of people thought with target date funds, that conservative side of the portfolio, well, that's, conservative meant to hedge downside risk. And unfortunately, what we just went through with the interest rates rising, we realized that is not the case, right? Bonds do have potentially a lot of risk, and some of your target date funds were, not high equity exposure. They were down 15, 20%, not much different than what, I saw some examples where like a 2025 fund was down 15% versus a 2055 fund was only down 18. So I mean, that's a pretty small difference between those two, especially when you look at how much equity exposure is in one versus the others. So really understanding what risk is and positioning it right.
True. So is it something that you guys, and I know I can't blanket statement put you on the spot because everybody's different, but is it something that advisors tend to, I talk with advisors across the country, and while it can be a useful tool, they often tend to lean towards there's better things to do with it. I guess maybe that's a better way for me to frame that question.
Yeah, so there's absolutely better ways to do it. We don't use target date funds. Especially because when we're positioning risk and getting into retirement, we've talked many times about our bucket, so now soon later. Well, our soon bucket is going to be a more conservative strategy, and that's where we're spending from. The later is going to be more long-term growth, So if you think of at a high level, the target date fund, they have the two of those blended into one. So if in retirement, you're spending out of a target date fund, well, you're getting a little bit of the bond, a little bit of the stock exposure with each distribution. You can't separate those two. So we structure them differently for that purpose. Plus you can just get better options if you're managing it outside of a target date fund. Target date funds, I think, serve a purpose. And that's really for that investor that isn't working with an advisor, just starting out maybe and looking at options in the 401k. They don't know what to pick. So it could be a good place to start. But as you get further down that path, maybe start working with an advisor, become more educated in markets. There could be some better options to consider.
All right. Well, if you've got some questions, need some help, check this out.
The Tax Smart Retiree is your comprehensive guide to mastering tax efficiency for a flourishing retirement. You will find indispensable advice and actionable strategies designed to enhance tax savings, maximize Social Security benefits, protect against market volatility, and develop a customized retirement plan. To get your free ebook, click the link in the show notes of today's episode and download your copy of the Tax Smart Retiree right now.
All right, folks, so that's going to wrap it up this week here for the podcast. So, again, if you've got questions about your target date fund, if you're in one, if you're thinking about getting involved with a financial professional and really looking at better options out there for your investments, for your money, for your future, then certainly reach out to a qualified pro in your area. If you need some help, reach out to Phil as well. He helps clients all across the country, not just in his native Michigan area. So, if you need some help and you're in another state, reach out to him. He might be able to help you as well. So all you got to do is find him online at philstaxhacks.com. That's the podcast website where you can subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you like Apple or Spotify or YouTube, and certainly subscribe to us on YouTube as well so you catch new episodes. But you can also just check him out on his main website. It'll redirect you back there as well. You can follow him on Facebook and lots of other social media platforms as well. So just check all that stuff out in the show note descriptions. There'll be the links to the main website and all that good jazz so that if you need something, you can reach out to Phil. And that's going to do it for this week. So thanks for hanging out with us. We always appreciate your time here on Phil's Tax Hacks and other retirement facts. See you, Phil.
Take care.
Investment advisory services offered through AFS Wealth Management. The content of this program is provided for informational purposes only and is not a solicitation or recommendation of any investment strategy. Investments and/or investment strategies involve risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will achieve its objectives.